I have a customer that loves colour almost as much as I do, and she was looking for a desk, so I sent her a picture of this one, which I had in my furniture stash. She loved it straight away, so we set about prepping it, getting it ready to paint in her bespoke custom style that she wanted. First of all, I had to strip that wax off because it was quite thickly coated in wax. I started out with my scraper and then moved to wire wool and white spirits, and my son got involved being a cameraman and filming that little segment. We also did this in a heat wave, so it was pretty warm going, got to keep hydrated. And then he got involved taking some of the wax off because we realised that that little cubby hole bit all came out. Here she is all naked and de-waxed. I then primed it using a clear primer and also treated the knots so they didn't bleed through. And my customer chose this electric cobalt blue colour, which is absolutely phenomenal. It's called Cobalt Blue and it's from Dixie Belle Paint. And then I had the task of trying to get the cubbies back in. Now I'm really grateful that this part came out because it made it really easy for me to be able to paint all of the insides of the cubbies. But getting this thing back in, I was about to give up. I don't know what happened, but I think basically it just needed a little bit of gentle persuasion with a scraper and my fist. It went back in eventually, but it really annoyed me. But we got there in the end. I'd like to say that the stenciling went to plan as well, and it also did not. My customer showed me a couple of pictures of something she wanted, but because of all the awkward kind of shapes and little drawers on this piece, it wasn't as easy as it looked. Some of the flatter areas were quite easy, like the top of this piece here, and also the top of the actual desk itself. Kind of straightforward, went to plan. But the side panels, they just took 2 or 3 attempts. So I just had to kind of keep going and make the pattern fit so that it looked like the vision that she had. Eventually we got there with a little bit of jiggery pokery. I managed to get the pattern to fit. I did have to chop my stencil up, but I'll be using this stencil over and over again because it's one of my favourites, and you can just create unique patterns with it every single time, so I don't mind that I chopped it up. I sealed the whole thing with Dixie Belle's satin clear coat, and I'm using a sponge applicator pad here, which is my absolute go-to when I'm applying top coats because it gives you a really flawless finish. Here's a couple of close-ups of the front and side panels, the top of the desk there. Here's a little reminder of what it looked like before, and here's the finished piece. If you know you've got a piece and there is some beautiful wood grain hiding underneath a dark varnish or an existing finish, but you want to add a little cheeky pop of colour as well, you can actually do that and come up with a compromise. So this gorgeous oak piece had some wood grain underneath that dark varnish that I exposed on the base, the top and one of the drawers. So 2 out of 3 of the drawers I painted in this really dark green shade called Collard Greens from Dixie Belle Paint. As you can see, coverage is 10 out of 10 as usual with Dixie Belle products. It goes on super easy. I'm just giving it a light spritz of water, and that's just going to help the paint lie flat and also helps the paint glide on nice and smooth. And then the final drawer, I decided to kind of add a little bit of paint, but also let the wood grain kind of do its thing as well. So I added a stencil on the top drawer in the same colour that I'd painted the other 2 drawers, and also the rest of the piece, excluding the base and the top. Once I'd done that, I just slightly distressed the edges of the other drawers, and then I clear waxed the top. But the clear wax kind of made the oak orange, and it was not looking exactly how I envisaged it. So I just added a little bit of brown wax over the top, and that just kind of brought that orange tone down a little bit and made it a little bit warmer. And I did the same to the top as well, and you can see the difference here, that orange versus that little bit more of a browner kind of tone. The inside, you should never abandon the inside of your drawers. Nobody wants dusty drawers. So I gave those a lick of Big Mama's butter. And here's a few close-ups of the finished piece, a reminder of the before, and here's the after. We've all seen these odd bedsides hanging around in charity shops, not really selling and a little bit boring. So I'm going to make this one a bit more interesting with the use of a 3D stencil on the drawer fronts. So first of all, I'm always going to start with a little bit of prep work. I cleaned it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning and then I gave it a scuff sand. Then I'm going to tape a stencil in place. I'm going to do this because it's going to stop the stencil from wobbling about all over the place. And then I'm going to use Dixie mud with a spatula and apply the paste over the top of the stencil with a light hand, making sure that I'm just applying a really thin, even coat over the top of the stencil. You can use this paste to create pretty much anything on the front of your piece and it will hold that shape. So I'm using it obviously with a stencil to create a 3D pattern, but you can also create some really interesting texture with this as well. So once I'd applied it over the drawers, I just lifted it straight up in the air to avoid the stencil from slipping. And then once it had completely dried, I just sanded any texture smooth so that I had a nice smooth 3-dimensional pattern. I like to prime my pieces once I've done a raised stencil. I'm using Dixie Belle's Boss Primer in grey, and that's just going to give me a nice blank canvas in order to put my paint over the top of. Once I'd applied a coat of the grey primer, I then went in with a really pretty colour from the Silk mineral paint range called Harbour. I'm applying this with a synthetic brush for a nice smooth finish. The best thing about this paint is that it's got a built-in top coat, so I don't need to top coat this. It's super durable and you can see the coverage is absolutely insane. I did do 2 coats just for full coverage to make sure I hadn't missed anywhere. And you can see I'm just moving my brush in all different directions to make sure that I get in all of the detail that I'd created with the raised stencil. The last thing I did is replace the handles. I say replace the handles, there wasn't any to begin with, so I found some in my stash and added those. Here's a close-up of the 3-dimensional pattern. You can use any stencil you like to create this image. I will list all of the products that I used in the description below if you want to have a look at those. Here's a quick reminder of what the piece looked like before, and here's the after. I reckon I hit the absolute jackpot with this piece. In fact, I loved it so much I ended up keeping it. So it was a Facebook Marketplace find and I love this type of furniture anyway, but Dixie Belle were about to launch a new stencil and I had a little sneaking suspicion that it looked perfect on this piece. I didn't want to sand it because notoriously this wood is quite bad for bleed through. So I cleaned it and then I primed it using Dixie Belle's Bond Emboss, which is a primer that means you don't have to sand the surface of your furniture before you can paint it. I then used the colour Yellowstone from their Silk mineral paint range, which is a fantastic coverage for a yellow, and it's also got a built-in top coat, so you don't need to top coat separately. Now this is the star of the show. It's Dixie Belle's bone inlay stencil, and I decided to cut it up so it comes on one big sheet like this. So I just used a craft knife with a ruler, so that had lots and lots of separate elements of the stencil that I could build my own design, and I just find that it's easier to use like this as well. So I started out by taping the little areas of stencil into the alcoves of the door, and this was going to form a kind of a bone inlay inspired piece. Obviously bone inlay pieces are very expensive and very beautiful, but this is a good way to create your own if you like that style but can't afford it, which I definitely can't. So I just started out by building the stencil and finding pieces of the stencil that would fit on my cabinet. And this stencil, I'll say stencil again in this video, this stencil is very versatile. Because I've chopped it up, it means that you can use it in lots of different ways, and no matter the shape or size of your piece, you should be able to find elements of it that will be able to fit, and you can make your own. So for example, there was a little bit of trim here, and there's a tiny little border piece that I just used to fill in. Again, the kind of surrounds around the door, I used this part of the stencil and that just created a nice border. I also filled in the sides. I just didn't include it on this video, but there is a longer video on my YouTube channel if you wanted to have a look at it. So I did the sides in exactly the same way. I then felt like just bringing it all together, it just needed a little bit of white around the frames of the door, and I also did the same across the top and the bottom of the piece, and that kind of just pulls it all together. And that's pretty much it. It's actually quite a simple makeover. It just looks very complicated, but it's a very, very easy way to create a really unique piece of furniture. Like I said, I ended up keeping this piece for myself because I just absolutely love it. Here's a couple of close-ups of the finished piece, a reminder of the before, and here's the after.